My name's Amy Sager. I'm the manager of Tender Funerals Illawarra in Sydney. We're based here in Port Kembla. We've been operating for 4 years now. I thought what I might do is I might just start by introducing myself a little bit and explaining how I became involved in Tender Funerals. And I'd also like to share a bit about my role and the role of the funeral directors here at Tender. And what that might look like for other tender funerals around Australia, what that role entails and what that funeral director needs to embody as well. So if we go back to 2008 is where it all really started for me. I entered the funeral industry when I was very, very young. I was in year 11 in high school, and I was watching a documentary in food technology, and 16-year-old me was watching a cadaver be dissected to understand how the food that we eat impacts our body. And I was sitting there thinking that, oh my God, that's a dead person. And that I had never seen one portrayed in such an ordinary way on the TV screen before, because the only time I had ever seen one portrayed was in horror movies or, you know, very unrealistic circumstances in film. And so I was really moved by watching the mortuary technicians doing the dissection, because they were so ordinary and they were so just another day in the office, and it was really not a big deal. And I was like, wow, that's a thing that people do. And then I thought, yeah, I bet I could do that. And then it became, no, I really want to do that. And so I was 16 years old at the time, and I sought out the advice of my careers advisor at Kingsgrove High School. And bless her, she was incredible. She was so shocked at first when I came in and said that I wanted to be a mortician. But she really worked with me to learn more about what that role was and what qualifications were required. And then also in seeking conversations with people who existed in that role so I could better understand what that was like. So we were, first of all, meeting with an embalmer, and we had a conversation, and I asked her a lot of questions and left with even more questions and even more passion for wanting to do that, feeling quite assured that that was in fact what I wanted to do. And then over a course of 6 months, we finally found a funeral home that would give me work experience. We learnt that many of them were owned by the same organisation, so we kept getting no's from that organisation. And you know, they were erring on the side of caution. I can see that as an adult now, but I did not take kindly to that as a teenager. And, you know, I was really fortunate to come across a company that were trying to get younger people into the industry, because many of them were reaching retirement age. And so they were trying to put together a bit of a longevity plan. And so my first mentor, Danae Cruz, took me under his wing and gave me placement. So I got to do a week of work experience, did that during my school holidays. And on that placement, I really got to have a little bit of a taste of almost everything that happened in the funeral home. So there was this really beautiful family who had lost their elderly parent, and she had had a prepaid funeral. So we asked if it would be okay if I sat in on that arrangement to organise the funeral. And, you know, they were so kind and accommodating in that meeting and letting me be a little fly on the wall for that. And then they invited me to the funeral afterwards. So I actually got an extra day of placement because I got to go back for their mother's funeral. So seeing that process the whole way through was so generous of them, and, you know, still so memorable all these years later. And I also had that moment, which for me was really quite a career defining moment, where I saw a body for the first time in real life. And that was really a big deal for me, because I knew I wanted to be a mortician. And I thought, if I can't handle that, then that really goes out the window. And so it was a really big deal. It was a huge deal. And I had all of those things running through my mind of what we see on TV. And that was all I knew of the dead in reality, really. And so whilst I felt that I was going to be okay doing that, you know, TV says otherwise, really. And so I just needed to have that reassurance in myself that that was going to be okay. And so you know, I was so prepared for the fact that it might be traumatizing that I hadn't considered that maybe it would just be ordinary. And I kind of describe it as almost like the world's biggest anticlimax, because it was like I had built it up so much to this defining point where I would see someone who'd passed away, and I slowly approached his coffin and he was laid out for a viewing with his family. And I was like, oh, is that it? He just looks like he's asleep. It was so like, oh, it's just a person. He looks normal. And so it was a really great introduction into, you know, working with the dead, because it really is an ordinary thing. And I think it's really important to capture that. And I still think back to that moment, because these days I deal with people every day who are seeing someone who's died for the first time. And so it's really helpful to call back on that experience and around what was going through my mind at that time, because that's not really a thing for me anymore. It's really very ordinary now. And so it's such a guiding memory, actually, that point. So anyway, I finished my placement there during year 11, and they gave me an opportunity to get employed there, because I was very keen to be a part of it, and I really loved my time there and my experience there. And so I got employment with them during my school holidays for year 11 and 12. And I was doing a lot of death registrations and funeral bookings and washing cars and ready for the day's funerals and all of those sorts of tasks. So then I finished my high school certificate I finished that on a Friday, and I started full-time work on a Monday. I was so keen and so excited. And so I think I was about 17 then when I started full-time work at the funeral home. And by that stage, I'd been there for 2 years or 1.5 years, and I was really a part of the furniture and had received a lot of training and had done a lot of funeral administration, staffing funerals and staffing viewings. But I wasn't yet doing funeral arrangements, which is where you would sit down with a newly bereaved family and organise the funeral. And it's such an insight into, I suppose, my youth at the time, because my funeral home wanted me to be doing that role. And I was like, oh no, I'm 17, people won't take me seriously. I'll wait till I'm 18. People will take me seriously when I can drink and vote. So I waited till I was 18, and then I started arranging funerals, which I was so competent at by that stage, because I had had 3 years of training and working towards doing mock arrangements with other funeral directors to be at that point. So I worked doing those meetings with families and attending funerals, but I still hadn't really experienced the mortuary, and that was the part that I was really most passionate about and most wanting to enter. As much as I really enjoyed this facet of the work, I still had that burning curiosity around the mortuary and wanting to work with the dead. So I still really had that goal of wanting to do embalming training and become an embalmer, which is a method of preservation of the body. And we didn't have a mortuary on site in our funeral homes. There was very limited opportunities in gaining that experience. So I'd had 1 or 2 experiences in the mortuary, but certainly not an everyday experience. And then when I was 19, our funeral home got sold. And it was a really big sale because our company was very large. So I got moved along to a sister company of the person who owned that part of the funeral home then. And in that sister company, there was a mortuary. So I got experience in that mortuary, but I faced a lot of challenge with my age and actually, very legitimate age discrimination actually. And so fortunately, I was quite a fiery 19-year-old that really stood up for myself, which I probably wouldn't do the same level as I did when I was 19 these days. And so I was a little bit like, how dare you? I'm going to do what I believe I should be able to do. And so I was given the opportunity to work in reception because I was too young to be a funeral director. So I marched in there and I said, I am not too young to be a funeral director, and you will give me mortuary training. And they were like, oh, perfect, mortuary. No one sees you in the mortuary. They won't see how young you are. You can have mortuary experience. And so that ended up working out really well for me because that gave me the opportunity to work in the behind the scenes part of the funeral home. So I worked in the mortuary. I worked putting handles and liners in coffins, washing cars, staffing funerals, and we just did a month of each role. So we did a month solid of prepping every single person in that funeral home for that month, and then the next month you'd wash cars every single morning, and then the next month you'd build coffins the whole month, and then you'd rotate back. And I hated washing cars, but I loved working in the mortuary. And one of my colleagues hated working in the mortuary. And I was like, I will trade you my cars for your mortuary. And so we used to have this arrangement. And because I had that real passion for working in that mortuary, my skills developed very quickly, which is like anything that you're passionate about, really. So I was able to learn that very quickly and show a lot of improvement very fast as well. Off the back of that, I requested to then go through mortuary school so that I could be a qualified embalmer. And they did let me do that, which was incredible. So I got to go to Melbourne to mortuary school, mortuary and funeral educators, and start on my certificate 4 in embalming. Now, part of that certificate is the history of embalming, and you learn anatomy, and you learn about the chemicals, and obviously how to embalm as well, which was amazing. And also that covered things like restorative art, how to do reconstruction of traumatic injury and those sorts of things as well, which I was also particularly passionate about. The course goes for a minimum of 18 months, and you have a lot of case studies that you have to do. So there's in-person parts to it, and then most of it is distance training through assessments, and you're assigned a mentor embalmer. And with your mentor embalmer, you then do case studies. So you do an embalm under the supervision of your mentor being present there, and then they'll sign it off as a case study. So you have to do 20 full embalms on your own of someone who's not had an autopsy, and then 10 embalms of someone who has had an autopsy, which is a much more extensive process in embalming. And then it turned out that that first mortician that I ever met became my mentor embalmer. So it was sort of a beautiful little journey to be connected with her. And sort of she saw me when I was 16, and then when I was in my early 20s doing that training as well. There was a point in that where a lot changed in my workplace, and I was finally old enough to be a funeral director again. So my role changed to front of shop, meeting families and spending a lot more time on funerals, which meant I had a lot less time in the mortuary. And I changed to a low tox lifestyle. So I cut out a lot of the toxins in my life, and formaldehyde is a carcinogenic product. And so I stepped away from completing the embalming course because I really decided that I loved embalming, but I didn't love my eyes and my nose burning while I did it. And I really felt quite passionate about reconstructive work that didn't necessarily mean that I had to expose myself to the risk of cancer. So I actually didn't complete my embalming training. It sits there in dormancy at the moment. I would have got halfway through my case studies and completed all the coursework. So if I ever wanted to go back, I could finish the case studies. But I ended up pivoting in what I wanted to be doing in the world, because I gained the mortuary experience to do the part of the mortuary that I loved the most. And as I had started working in funeral arrangements, I had a little introduction into the world of death literacy, which was a new world for me. And in that world of death literacy, I was doing work with death doulas who were working with families in the lead up to a death, and then they were having these incredible empowered funerals and taking the body home, and, you know, really amazing funerals that were not the norm for what our funeral home was doing. And again, it became something I was widely passionate about, and my funeral home humoured me because they didn't necessarily want to be working on those funerals because they sort of saw them as more of a time drag. They took more resources from them from what it would normally for a funeral. But I was so there for that. I was like, I loved every part of it. So they kind of would humour me and go, oh, here we go, this family want to do that. Amy, you can deal with them. And I'd be like, yes, I get to deal with them. So it was this like incredible journey, and it opened up this door to death literacy, and I ended up speaking in death literacy conferences about my experiences in a traditional funeral home offering those services. I learned how to do washings and dressings with different cultural groups that would normally do that in their practice. But it wasn't something that we could offer to everyone. They had to already know they wanted it and advocate for it, and then we would provide that for them. And it was just something that I was like, people need to know this. People need to know that they can care for their person, and people need to know that they can look after their dead, or that they need to know that they can take the body home. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to have to start a business. I'm going to have to do it myself. And I was so not interested in starting a business. I just wanted to see that exist in the world. So I had started the very beginnings of a business plan. And then someone in my death literacy community said, Amy, there's this documentary that you're going to love. You need to watch it. So I watched the Tender documentary, which was when it had just aired on TV. And I was like, oh my God, I don't have to start a business. I can just help them start their business. And it was very exciting. And at that stage, I had no intention of even being their funeral director or even necessarily being a part of the project. I just wanted to see that project exist in the world. And so I contacted Jenny and I said, I can't tell you who I am or where I work, but I can help you. And it just sort of went from there because she didn't have a funeral director that was working with them. So part of my embalming course was studying the rules and mortuary design, and what was required for building a mortuary that would meet the workplace health and safety requirements for dealing with carcinogenic products and embalming. So it was sort of like this beautiful marriage of my cumulative experience by that stage. And so I worked with Jenny and became so emotionally invested that when she did offer me the role to be the funeral director, I couldn't say no at that stage. So I joined the community down here. So that was in probably 2014, 2015. And then in 2016, Tender Funerals Illawarra in Sydney opened our doors, which was incredibly exciting. So we've been open for 4 years now. And as we have grown, we now have 5 funeral directors. We've got a few casuals. We've got a lot of volunteers and a funeral administrator as well. And so it's really grown into something, and it's grown into its own life force really, because what our funeral directors embody is so big and so incredible, which really brings me to the next point that I want to speak about, which is what is a tender funeral director? Why is that different, and how does that look different to what it has been in my past and in that experience of working in the traditional industry? I came to Tender Funerals, I think it was like 8 years experience or something by that stage. We next employed our social work student. That was our next funeral director. Oh no, our next funeral director was another funeral director I had worked with in a previous funeral home. She was our second funeral director, and she came with full experience short of embalming. So she knew how to arrange funerals and meet with families, conduct funerals, which means being the lead staff member at the funeral, how to do viewings, how to provide mortuary care. And we really upskilled her in community empowerment. That was what the working point was learning how to facilitate a family doing a washing and dressing without just by default stepping in and helping them with it yourself. So we used to have to do this thing to sort of change our default setting, which is we would stand in the mortuary with the family to do a washing and dressing, and we would hold our hands behind our back so that we wouldn't just accidentally just help them a little bit with fixing up the shirt, because we really needed to be empowering people rather than disempowering them. And so if we swanned our way through it, they would just feel completely incompetent, like I could never do it that way. But if we step back and let them even have a little bit of struggle with putting a t-shirt on, then that gave them an opportunity to overcome something and then feel empowered in that process, because they'll be like, we did that, we put that shirt on, and it was hard, but we still did it. And so we really learned how to hone in that skill of empowering people in a way that they could feel proud of what they had done, and in a way that led them to feel safe and held in that environment, but also like they had an opportunity to do it themselves. And so we no longer have to hold our hands behind our back because we've become really good at that. But as a traditional funeral directors working in that space, that was a thing for us to have to work, make sure that we didn't accidentally go there, I'll just do that for you. Completely well-meaning. The next funeral director that we employed was our social work student. So we work with Wollongong University for their students to do 500 hours as one of their placements for their social work degree. And we always keep a relationship with our students. Their other placements, they seem to part ways, but with us, they seem to stay as volunteers, which is really incredible. And something we're looking into how they can develop that further in their other programs. But Jade was our first social work student, and she didn't know yet what she wanted to do in social work, but she knew she wanted to do a social work role and work in that space. So after her placement, she went on to do another placement in the hospital system and stayed volunteering with us. And when we next had an opportunity for a role for a funeral director, we said, Jade, you know how to do this already. You're a social worker, you understand community empowerment, you've done so much volunteering with us, you already know how to do a family washing and dressing and how to staff a funeral. So she was a really great fit for us. And Jade is still one of our funeral directors now, and we get such great feedback from her, and we're very proud to have a social worker in our ranks here. And our families respond really well to that, because it really is in line with what we do at Tender. It is a model of social change and community empowerment, and we bury people's loved ones, really. That's like the side thing that we do, because really what we're doing is we're empowering an entire community when someone has died. We're not just serving that family. And what happens is every time someone dies, there are entire communities that get empowered. And it's a bit of an education every funeral we do for every person who goes to that funeral. And what happens when all of those people in our wider community attend those funerals is like a group awakening. It's an education. And that's how you create social change, and that's how you create cultural change in the way that we do death. And so when you're looking at what skills a funeral director has at Tender, a Tender funeral director is a community worker, and it's someone who empowers communities, and they also care for the dead, and they also attend funerals, and they also, oh, I'm watching the spider above me walk. It was still for so long. Oh, I don't know what it's doing, it's running. Okay, so a Tender funeral director really hones in all of that. And so we've been able to work with Jade to develop her mortuary skills. So Jade can now do things like, if a family authorize, we know we work off consent-based care. So if they authorize us to do intrusive procedures, if someone wants the deceased mouth closed or their eyes closed, Jade is a social worker who works in a mortuary. So essentially that makes her a mortician as well. She knows how to do those things. And so it's really important that everyone who works here knows how to do everything, because we want to not only be an empowered community in the sense of the people who are outside of Tender, but we want to be an empowered community in the people who work here. So we don't divide up our roles as one person's the mortician, one person meets the family, one person answers the phone. It's really all in. We all do everything here, and we all work to empower each other when there's something that we're not sure about. One of our other funeral directors really understands Catholic funerals. She was raised Catholic, so she just has an insight into the practice. It's not a new experience for her, and it'll be so easy for her to just do all of the Catholic funerals, but that's actually incredibly disempowering to the people on our staff who weren't raised Catholic and don't understand that process. So we actually intentionally either partner them up or don't send our Catholic to those funerals, so that we can empower our staff members who don't feel like that's their default setting, so they can become familiar with it, because that leads to an informed staff where everyone knows how to do everything and confidently. And that's something that, you know, that's new in the way that we do that. Most places would go, great, that's your niche, you can do that, you do that well, and that's a good model. But it's even better if everyone feels confident in being able to work in any way they're asked to. So we really work with families in conflict as well. So it's really helpful to have some conflict resolution skills, because grief can really exacerbate difficult situations in families, and not everyone does get along in their family. But what's really helpful to know is how to hold family council, because family council can mean that everyone can leave that situation having had a healthy bereavement and having felt like they were heard and like they had an equal experience to a member of their family who might have had equal rights to the body. So we really work to go around the room of people and say, what do you need? Okay, great. And now what do you need? And what do you need? And that might even sometimes lead to having 2 different funerals. Their needs might be so different that there's more than one funeral that takes place. And we've had so many experiences. We had one boy who died and his grandmother was staunch Catholic and his mother was Wiccan. And we had 2 funerals. So we had a full requiem mass and then we got in the car and went to the next funeral, which is a pagan Wiccan funeral. And we just did both of them. We're like, it's sort of like that Mexican ad where they go, why don't we just have both? Because that's what you can do. Like, why not? And so and it didn't even cost them that much more. They just had to pay church hire for the difference. So it just opens a door where there's a possibility for whatever anyone needs. Let's just do that. Even today, as I'm speaking later this afternoon, I'm doing a Muslim burial for someone who had an Australian family, and we've managed to blend both of those cultural needs so that everyone felt heard in that and had a much better experience rather than feeling disempowered through that process. And so that's really the strong thread through all of what we do is empowerment for people. What we work on is making funerals affordable for people. But the most incredible thing is that being a not-for-profit organisation, by default, it's already a lot more affordable, but we can work with families to help them make informed decisions around what each of their decisions might cost. So that if they are working to a really tight budget, we can say, hey, you have options. Either way, the body will be at the funeral. But did you want to pay for a hearse or would you like to pay for a van? Because you have some flexibility there in what that costs you and the mode of transport that we use. So we actually work to unpick each step so that families are making empowered decisions that work to their budget and work to what they want. A really interesting learning for me was people don't rate hearses apparently because we seem to use our van a whole lot more than we use the hearse. And I think that's just because people would rather not pay extra to have a van because they don't value the hearse for what it would cost them. It's just not an important thing to them. They would much rather spend that money on a great location for the funeral instead. And it's a good indication as to how we have assumed what people want, because that's so default everywhere else. But when you actually ask people what they want and they can have a truly empowered process where they're making informed decisions, they end up with a funeral that's crafted to exactly what they want and something that they can feel proud of at the end. And so they really rely so much less on their funeral director. We're so not at the center of it. It's really them at the center of it. And we're just sort of the people who will take care of the logistics that they don't want to deal with that's left once all the decisions have been made. And so it's really quite amazing when you look at those different, like what that role looks like with Tender. So I think as we work towards opening Tender funerals across Australia in other communities, I know that there will be a lot of people who want to participate in that and work with that. And I think really through the upskilling of volunteers, there is potential for those people to then have the skill set to be funeral directors with Tender. But it's also really important that each Tender have a funeral director that has experience as a funeral director that will help us navigate the laws required for cremation or burial or appropriate handling of the deceased and storage of the deceased. And it will also help with understanding protocols at cemeteries and crematoriums and how to navigate those as well. Most essentially though, it's important to have someone at each Tender with an in-depth understanding of mortuary care. While we work off consent-based care and not everyone requires intrusive procedures, there will always be cases that require extra expert attention. So in the case of someone who's had traumatic injury that may require reconstruction, or even minor issues that we encounter in the mortuary, such as different types of fluids, or if someone has a mark in their skin, small, tiny injuries that happen, how to stop bleeding, how to manage issues such as purge, how to close a mouth and close an eyes. All of those things are so common that it's important that you have someone on your staff that knows how to manage that, or in your community, I should say. I'm not going to say that that has to be the person you employ, but it has to be someone in that community that can step into that role and manage that easily and quickly. The reason that it's helpful to have that person accessible is you may not necessarily know when that's going to come up in your mortuary, and you often want to deal with that in the moment. It's not something you can book in for next week to deal with. And so that's why it's really important to upskill the people in that community, so at least one of them know how to manage that, and then have a long-term plan on training the funeral directors that are there to know how to manage those things as well, because it is a risk to have everything rely on one person, because everyone gets sick, everyone has holidays, everyone has days they're not on call. And so it's really important to have a healthy balance in that, so that the business is not vulnerable without that person. So I would really urge our funeral directors to know how to perform mortuary care, but also really to know how to empower families in a funeral, in the planning process and the execution of the funeral, and also how to empower families in the mortuary in caring for their own dead. It's really, we are social workers. Interestingly, I never realized that until I had a social work student. And obviously through her studies, she was linking everything we do to the different social work models. And I was like, oh, wow, it really is social work. And I just had never connected the dots of that before. And so I think that really encompasses what it is to be a tender funeral director and what that role involves. I think that there does have to be someone that has that experience so that they can guide the rest of that community in our way of doing things. It's not even a new way, it's a very old way that we're returning to in doing things. And it's just important that all of the people that are there are united in their values of it being an empowered experience, of it being incredibly ethical, and it being incredibly transparent. I think honesty is such a valued thing, and almost like an underappreciated thing sometimes, because when you're being honest, sometimes that's being kind, and being kind is so important. And I think kindness is not always an easy thing, because sometimes you have to do something that's difficult to be kind. And that might look like, explaining to a family what their decomposed family member looks like, so that they can make a decision themselves if they want to see them or not. And so that kindness is sharing those details, where it would be so easy to just say, oh, I don't recommend that and you shouldn't do it. Instead, the kindness is saying, would you like to know the details, so that you can make that decision, and then going there. And that's where we really sit in being ethical, because that's how people make informed decisions. It's where we sit in being honest, and it's where we sit in being kind to families. So, that's something that is really important to have embedded in the practice of your funeral directors, is kindness. And that's actually in our credo as well. There are a few things that are in our credo that would absolutely be non-negotiable, but I dare say if people are interested in tender, they're already value aligned to those things. And so it's just about exercising that skill so you can really hone in on it and sharpen it. So I think that really covers what our funeral directors need to have in their skill bank and work towards in their skill bank. I might even open it up for questions to see if anyone has any questions about what I've talked about or what's required. Lee.
Yes, I'll ask. Yes, lovely to hear you, Amy. I do remember hearing you at the Powerhouse Museum maybe 4 years ago. So a fair little way back in your journey. Yeah, thank you. I'm an end-of-life doula in Hobart now. So look, one of the questions I've got is, how often have you got people coming sort of to talk about what they might want before death? So whether they have a life-limiting illness or whether they're aging, are just thinking about, you know, stepping into this and doing their planning early.
We have a lot of that. We have a lot of people in our community doing that. At one stage, we got so busy we had to make a wait list for them because we just couldn't keep up with meeting them between the funerals that we had actually going at the time. So I would say we have one every 1 or 2 weeks at least. We ended up putting in place a fee for people to come and meet with us because it was taking about an hour or two of time for our funeral director, and being not-for-profit, we do have to cover our hours in the way that we work. And because we were having really in-depth conversations with those people, so we could make decisions. And we realized that in order for us to be able to do that, we would need to charge them like 1 or 2 hours of time for our funeral director. So we have now a small fee for people to come and pre-arrange a funeral. But what we do is we say, this is pre-arranged. We keep a copy and we give the family a copy of everything that we've recorded from that conversation. And they can just hold on to that. And the beauty of that is that they're not locked into anything. And they understand. We invite them to bring their whole family. So it's a family conversation. Everyone's on the same page and has a chance to ask their parent questions if they don't agree with the decision that they've made, so they can better understand those decisions. And like I said, they're not locked in. So if they then up and move to another part of the world or another part of Australia that doesn't have a tender, they have access to all of that information they've made. And that's really important, that because that's true empowerment. It's great if they come and use tender funerals, but it's also so much bigger than that. So we do that now. We don't do prepaid funerals. Right. Some funeral homes do prepaid funerals, but we don't. We just keep it on file. And that's just because we're not for profit. So we would operate at a loss if it locked in today, and then our suppliers upped their prices in 10 years' time. So yeah, a lot.
Right. And where are people coming from? Is a lot of it now word of mouth because you've been around for so long and people have attended funerals or been part of something and appreciate that?
Pretty much, I would say 85% of our work is word of mouth from people who've attended funerals or had someone in their community who recommended us through an experience of their own. Some of it is through the media. We do experience spikes in our numbers every time we do a really big media piece. Conversations, when Jenny was on Conversations, the phone just rang off the hook of people asking about tender funerals across Australia, but also for funerals for themselves, for pre-arrangements. So that always gives us a little boost. But so far, we actually haven't had to do any paid advertising in 4 years. Which is really huge because most funeral homes do. But because we are embedded in our community and we work off community empowerment and, you know, community education, people know about us here. We're ingrained with our people. And so that's a beautiful side effect of that, is because when someone dies, they know what to do. And if they don't know what to do, they'll ask us what to do.
Wonderful. Yeah, great model. Thank you.
Hi, Amy. Greetings from New Zealand. I'm tuning in out of it.
Oh my gosh, I think you guys have one of my favorite death practices.
Oh, right. Well, so interesting. I had a meeting with some Māori carvers yesterday because I'm trying to set up a death care collective in our community. And we're talking about this idea of a community casket where there's a liner or something like that, and it gets used repeatedly by whoever wants to be sort of held in the casket that would be carved by these guys that I was meeting with. And they were saying that the tangi, the Māori funeral practices, actually were brought in by colonisers, and it's not their traditional practice. I'd never heard this before. The traditional practice was put the body up just outside the village and watch it decay and decompose and be taken away by whatever other animals wanted to be part of that, and I'd never heard of that. So he said it was an Irish thing. I got it from, but I don't know. Anyway, is there any talk of tender coming over here, or any chance of that, some kind of partnership happening?
I haven't heard any talk, but I am Tender Illawarra in Sydney. I am not Tender Australia. So for all I know, there could be conversation in Tender Australia. My understanding is that we're focusing on Australia first and getting that up and running. But if there is a community that is in New Zealand, I really encourage them to get in contact with us, because we don't approach communities. Communities have to come and approach us. And say, we would like a tender in your community,
Right.
In our community. And we have a working group that's willing to work towards it. So we exist in communities that say, we want you here, and we have a working group willing to work towards it. So that's how it works. So if you have a working group in your area that are interested in having a tender funerals there, make contact with us, and Tender Australia, being Jenny and Emily, we'll have that conversation more in depth with you.
Cool. Yeah, I did a training with Zenith Virago, and what you said about the empowering the community is something that I took away from what she said, and that it becomes an intergenerational thing, and the young people in the community where the practices you're talking about are well known and well established and actually expected now. They move away and they take that expectation into their new environments, and so it kind of it populates thinking beyond a geographical area, which is quite cool.
That's so cool. It's true though. It's so true. Did anyone else have any questions about the role of the funeral director, or the skill set required for a funeral director, or anything remotely related? Yeah.
I don't have a question, Amy, but I just think the incredible insight and wisdom that you've gained is really marvelous. And I think that you talk a lot about kindness, which of course I believe is a fundamental. I think though, from that too, what you've shown is courage. And I think if you look at the work of Stephanie Darick, some of you, Rachel, you may know the work of Stephanie Darick. She believes implicitly that inherent with our value base and our community collaboration and connection, courage is a great gift to drive us on. And I really commend you. It's wonderful to see the work that's going on. So thank you. Really enjoyed listening to you.
Oh, thank you. I've never looked at how courage fits into it. And I suppose in a way it does. But I'm going to do some reflection on that and see how that fits in. It's actually written into our credo that kindness is our compass. That's the actual line in our credo. And then we have points underneath that elaborate on that a little bit further. But courage, I like that.
Sometimes, as you were talking about, sometimes kindness is not manifest in a way that people would traditionally imagine, and takes a lot of courage to be present and to be still in the face of death and mourning. And I think it just connected with me. I thought, yes, this is, you've obviously seized the day, and the courage has been there. So well done. I really think it's marvellous.
Thank you.
I'm a funeral celebrant. I'm not a death doula, but I've done a lot of funeral work. So
yeah. Well, I think funeral celebrants, they do have a really big understanding into this world. Are you in one of the working groups with Tender?
No, she's not. But we'd love to.
No, she's not. I think funeral celebrants make wonderful contributions to working groups, because the role of the celebrant in the funeral is so enormous. It's the ceremony. It's the part that helps all of those people travel to a point where they can say goodbye in a way that is helpful. And so that responsibility is enormous. And so we're very picky around what celebrants we use with Tender, because we have an expectation that they will take that community through that journey. It's not just, hi, this happened, goodbye. And if you've done Zenith training, you'll really understand that.
Anyway, thank you. I just wanted to share that. But yeah, that was great listening to you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I've got a couple more questions if you do have time, Amy. You talk about embalming. Is there much of that being done at all, or is that really just for sort of transporting bodies quite distances overseas?
Our embalming here is done for repatriations, meaning taking the deceased overseas on a flight, or for above ground interment, being a crypt, a vault, or a mausoleum. So that's when embalming is legally required. In many places, I know New Zealand, you're raising your eyes because everyone there is embalmed, but here we have a cool plate, and so we can take a body at home or to their home for up to 5 days without embalming, because we have a cool plate which meets the legal requirements for taking a deceased home. In other funeral homes, they don't normally have cool plates, and in those cases they would embalm the deceased to be out of refrigeration overnight or for a period at home. So we have a lower instance of embalming. There have been some cases where we've given families the option between a cool plate or embalming. But when they hear, as part of informed decision making, we explain that embalming is an intrusive procedure, and we answer their questions around that they have. And they've all selected using a cool plate instead of embalming. I think there was one that we did choose to embalm, and he was New Zealand, he was Maori, and he had died outdoors and wasn't found for a period of time. So his body was not in a good way, and the process of decomposition was quite advanced. And so the decision was made that he would be someone that would really benefit from having embalming to halt any further changes in his body during that period at home. So embalming has its place. Absolutely. You're speaking to an embalmer in saying, yeah, absolutely. But it doesn't, it's not necessarily always required when we sometimes would otherwise.
Will you excuse me, everybody? I have to go to another commitment. Good to see you all. Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you for joining us.
See you next.
Bye.
Well, I've got one more little question. It's perhaps not just the funeral director, but just with, have you got any tips or ideas around working with children, young children particularly, with, death of a very close family member?
Yes, it's something we do really well here, and it's something I'm also very passionate in, so I've done a lot of research into that. We really advocate for empowering children to make their own decisions. So there's a few parts to that. There's what you say to a child, there's what experience they have, and you have access to the body. And the first thing would be getting really clear on the language that you use with a child when you're explaining death, because quite often that's the first time they're even hearing the concept of death. And so it's about having a community meeting in your family and saying, and the people who are in that child's immediate community, who's going to be spending time with them and who would be identified as their safe people that they will probably ask questions of. And so you say, this is the terminology that we're all agreeing to use, because consistency is really important, because it's learning a complete new concept. So if one person's saying they're going to heaven, someone else is saying they're sleeping, someone else is saying that they've died, there's inconsistency in that. And so it's really helpful to be considerate of their cultural and spiritual beliefs in that, so that everyone's consistent in that. Or if there's no such beliefs, then it's helpful to steer away from the word sleeping, because it can lead to anxiety around sleep and nighttime, and the understanding of its permanence. And to use words like they died or their body stopped working, so that they can understand what death is. What is incredibly helpful is if the child has access to the deceased and to the body, because then they can understand what dead is and what dead means. And so what we do is we set up viewings when we have children on a scissor lift, so that we can drop the deceased down to the height really close to the ground, and we sort of just scatter cushions around, so that the child is empowered to go as close or as far away as they want to, as opposed to being really high up in a coffin where an adult has to pick up the child and sort of like put them really close so they can see over. Then the child can't decide just how close they want to get in that circumstance. So we let the children approach at their own time, and then we just sort of say, you know, say it's Granny. Here's Granny. What you'll notice is if you touch Granny, she'll feel really cold, and that will feel really different to how she normally is. And you know, you can see that her eyes are closed, and if you watch her chest, you'll see that her chest isn't moving anymore and it's not rising and falling. So it's almost like a mindfulness exercise on what looks different here. Let's just take a moment to pause and understand what's different now that Granny has died. Because then that helps them to recognize, oh, that's what they mean, her body stopped working.
Yep.
It's not working anymore. And so that then helps to understand the concept of death. But it's really about creating a space where that child can say, I don't want to be in this room. I don't want to be a part of this. And if they don't want to be a part of it, then great. Empower them to be able to make their own decisions around that. So people say, should I have my child at the funeral? And I was like, that depends. Does your child want to be at the funeral? Because if they do, they should go. But if they don't want to be at the funeral, don't make them go. And it's just about having a model of continual offerings. So we say, it's never too late to change your mind until it's already happened. And so if you create that, then people can just do what they feel like doing in that moment. And that will then mean that their story in their future as adults is, I went and saw Nan and she died, rather than I was forced to have a funeral. I've been traumatized ever since.
Yep. Thank you for that.